The ninth question of the ACE test reads, as we see it right there on the screen, which is, I had a household member depressed or mentally ill, and or a household member attempted or committed suicide.
Yeah.
There are quite a few things happening in this question. First of all, there is depressed and then mentally ill, and mentally ill includes depression. Okay, so depression and mental illness are not two different things. Mental illness is a wider umbrella term that includes depression, but then mental illness also includes all sorts of other, what could you say, mind altering states, such as borderline, pathological pervert narcissism, bipolar depression, schizophrenia, psychotic sort of states, and so on. Now, do we intend, when we use the word mental illness, do we want to pathologize or blame or point the finger at people that do suffer from mental illness? By all means not, especially not in this live, especially not in my work as a psychotherapist. I'm not a psychiatrist, and I've made a clear distinction between the work of a psychiatrist and a psychologist on my YouTube channel. But I encourage whoever is listening now to recognize that mentally ill are in and of themselves not words that are loaded with pathology. Mentally means of the mind. It's an adverb, right? That means of the mind. And ill simply means not well. So somebody who is not well in the mind, of the mind. What do we mean by that not well? We will be exploring today and possibly the next slide as well. So then we move on, and we see household member. So remember that the ACE test mostly focuses on people that are very close to us, and particularly primary caregivers, and then siblings. And in cases like your culture, Rene, that would include, cousins, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers, because as I understand it, you have regular contact with these extended family members, right?
Yeah.
So a little later, we might discuss also this aspect. What does it mean to be an household member in the context of a Western society where the family is just two parents, sometimes now even one, and one child or two maximum sometimes. Very different scenario from what I think, Rene, is your experience of family, both in your own family and families of friends that you have there. Okay, so household member attempted or committed suicide. So again, there's a distinction being made here. Attempted means that the person has taken active steps to die, but did not succeed. So they woke up or they emerged out of the injury that they caused themselves through poison, some form of poison, or some form of action, such as hanging or cutting and so on, that did not succeed. And or then committed suicide, which means a successful attempted suicide, right? Where the person does not wake up anymore and passes away. So quite a lot of things happen in this question, but it does connect with what you were saying before, because we have been talking about delusions. In the mind of the 18 years old who is sitting on this huge gun on top of the helicopter, delusional about the worth of the people onto which he's shooting his big bullets, right? Or cannons or grenades and so on and so on. And essentially what, all of this question here entails is a form of delusion. That's at least how I interpret mental illness. It's a separation between, like a very wide separation, unhealthy separation, dysregulating separation between reality and the way that brain is perceiving reality. If we talk about depression, for example, one of the common causes of depression is the sense that we are pretty worthless. Well, if you are a human, then you are worthy of attention, love, care, right? Just by being born a human, you are worthy of all the best things of life. And of course, somebody here might say, I saw a documentary this week actually with a friend about pedophilia. And there is a jail in the USA that is specific for pedophiles. And so they've built this $400 million in basically building to house people that have been convicted of being pedophiles. And Louis Theroux, one of my favorite documentaries, as I've already mentioned in one of the first few lives that we made here, goes and visits this penitentiary institution and talks to some of these pedophiles. And there is a lot of discomfort. Being a pedophile today is highly criminalized, and it's a very, very touchy topic, particularly in the context of the USA. Not that I want to downplay, how important the trauma that is caused onto minors when an adult takes advantage of their body, right? Even before they come to be in touch with their own sexuality. But it is a topic that is treated differently in the USA. And I forgot why I'm mentioning this, but I think it's to do with delusions, right? It's somebody, right? Okay, so you were showing there the last question is someone who went to prison, but anyway, we're talking about delusions, Rene, yeah. And so obviously there is a delusional aspect to being a pedophile, right? It's like. And that's what the documentary shows at some level. There are some pedophiles, a very small minority, unfortunately, that is able to emerge out of their sickness, their delusion, and that see how delusional it was to believe that a child would want that sexual interaction. Oftentimes, actually, the pedophile seems to be aware that this is just something that they want and not the child. But there is a detached perspective between what the reality of the child is and the reality of the adult. And the adult is not able to take ownership of that difference and distance, and then they take advantage of the child. So that's what I mean by mental illness in my case. And that's how I treat mental illness, well, in my work. If somebody comes to me saying I'm mentally ill, what I'm hearing is I have difficulties reading reality and adapting to it in a regulated and positive way.
And thank you for that introduction and just creating the foundation of the discussion, whereby relating to what you've been discussing so far, mental illness, what it is, and the delusion that we've discussed before. What I'm curious about is, Nicolas, can you actually include an aspect that we've also discussed before, whereby you also touched on the last live and the live before that, whereby we discussed that someone's situation doesn't change their innate nature.
Right.
So this person who is mentally ill, he's unwell, that's his situation. He's depressed, that's their situation. And they attempted what they attempted. In fact, even you shared a very good story of a client who, even in that attempt, expressed their innate nature. So seeing it from a child's point of view who's witnessing this household member, which can be a variety of definitions, including my own culturally, would you say that is it possible that whoever would say yes to this question, their view of the household member as they are will not be defined by their state, whether they are mentally ill or not, or what they did, but are also the fact that they are innate nature, that, like you said once, that your uncle is a very jovial person. This household member identity, can we actually adding the innate nature to the situation that they're going through, which it's rather unfortunate that they're not well.
You know, it's interesting what you ask, because I think having a mental, like a severe mental illness, schizophrenia, borderline, uh, deep chronic depression, debilitating depression, is a very, very mind altering experience, body and mind, actually, because our hormonal systems are very much coordinated by the central part of our nervous system, which we call the brain. When clients come to me with some of the heavier sort of traits of mental illness, and because I'm not a psychiatrist, I don't deal with the heaviest aspects of mental illness, because that often requires a level of intervention that would include chemistry, that would include asylums or some form of containment, as institutional containment. So within the psychotherapy world, when I do deal with someone who is heavily depressed, for example, or borderline, I tell them, you know, because you have never figured out what this is doing to you, you have actually never experienced yourself in the world. And so by that means also all the
Mm.
friends and people around them have never really experienced them as they could be, right? So that essence of them is hidden away in the very overwhelming and overarching state of mental illness of that person in that time of their lives. I think at some level, addictions, any kind of addictions, although they have a foundation of trauma, they act somewhat differently, and they're not so pervasively affecting of character. It is, I think, in my own opinion, the analogy would be to think of somebody taking some form of hallucinogenic or some form of drug 24 hours a day. You know, if I took
Wow.
LSD or ayahuasca or were drunk 24 hours a day, then I'm not never able to come back to any form of normality, and therefore I'm not never able to come back to expressing myself from a place of regulation and normality. Of course, for example, being an alcoholic, at some level you're never sober. Right? If you're an alcoholic, you're never sober, fully sober. But there are clearly, you know, periods of heavy drinking and periods of much lighter drinking, and so we see a shift. We see a shift between the person who is heavily drinking, the person who is only lightly drinking, and as we observe this shift towards the heavy drinking and away from the heavy drinking, we can speculate as to what that person is in essence, right? We see a
Mhm.
direction of change. But if there was a constant level of drunkenness and a constant level of behavior, and we saw barely any change, then we would have a much harder time in understanding who this person is. And I think mental illness is this. It's a mental state that is so pervasive that we can hardly see any difference. And reason for which this question that we are touching on is, you know, mentioning suicide in that sentence, because often when you have a situation where you see no change, you become completely hopeless and helpless. And so when you're completely hopeless and helpless and you feel to be a burden, very often you are approaching this point where killing yourself is the most logical and the most beneficial outcome, not just for you, but for everybody. So experiencing a constant level of a mind altered reality, uh, you know, defocused, let's say, state is very is very grave and difficult to deal with. When you have a household member that is in that state, you can't avoid, as we will find out with a beautiful interview we will have with a member of Al-Anon, which is one of these groups that I was mentioning last week, are there to help people who have an alcoholic in their family and need to be able to come back to a place of peace with that and take care of their own lives. We will find out, talking to this person, that when someone has such altered states, the people around also become very, very dysregulated. You know, if the person that is mentally ill can kill themselves pretty much any time of the day that you have gone to school or you have gone to work, how do you think your concentration level is going to be, you know, when you are at school, when you are at work? I remember when I was younger, a friend of the wife of my father was a repeated sort of offender in a way, in the way that she had tried and attempted suicide a dozen times over, you know, 3 decades. And I would hear the wife of my father speak about this person with some form of compassion, for sure. They were still friends, but it was so obvious. And I went to see her actually once, but it was so obvious that it was so difficult for the wife of my father to be a friend with this person, because of course the threat of loss is something that we don't want to live with, right? If you are a person who is thinking of suicide and attempting suicide several times, the people around you are suffering that uncertainty at a great deal. And so then if I say this and the person that is thinking of suicide right now hears me, they think, well, then obviously I should kill myself because I'm such a burden to them, and I want to free the world from being a burden. And that's a grave mistaken conclusion. But it is a conclusion that we come to so logically, because the assumption of the person who is mentally ill and wants to kill themselves is that there is nothing that they can do towards their mental illness and their desire for suicide. And that's a big mistaken assumption. Also, what often happens for people who want to kill themselves, and also people who are depressed, is that they suffer gravely from anxiety. They suffer greatly from dysregulation, so very poor sleep, poor digestion just all over the places, so very poor regulation. And of course, the first thing that you do with a person that is suffering this way in the work, you know, in my own field, in my work, is to try to bring some regulation to this person, to try to make them go to sleep at the regular time, make them get up at a regular time. I have a client who suffers from and has been suffering from nightmares since he was 3, massive, wow, very violent nightmares every night almost of his life. And so, you know, I know how the impact of sleep is so huge in so many areas of our lives, particularly emotional regulation. And with this client, it's very, very difficult to bring any kind of emotional regulation because of the incredibly dysregulated sleep that there is there. But it doesn't mean that we cannot talk about it, and it doesn't mean that it cannot try, right? And that already lifts some of the burden that a mentally ill person or a person who is suicidal and wants to kill themselves has. So there's always something that can be done to heal the dysregulation, to mutate, transform, shift the dysregulation towards a more regulated state. I have, for example, an older client who is, you know, when we grow older, all our organs become less clocked. So there is a master clock the pineal gland in our brain is called the master clock. It's called the master clock because there are other glands that clock the functioning of the organs in our body. The master clock is the one that coordinates the function of those clocks that are closer to the other organs, the liver, the digestion, the breathing. And as we grow older, the pineal gland is being affected by dysregulated neurotransmitters activities. So basically, our hormonal activities become dysregulated. This affects the way in which the ganglia, neuroreceptors in our brains, are reabsorbed at night. We lose the quality of the depth of our sleep, which means that the ganglia cannot be reabsorbed, which means that the signalings in our brains get disrupted. They become noisy. And because of this, the clocks then also, become dysregulated. And the effect of that, and this happens to all of us as we grow older, and the effect of that is that indeed most of our organs go out of sync with each other. We start to have tachycardia, we start to have, which is a dysregulated heart. We start to have, urine dysfunction, whereby we can't control the retention of urine anymore. All sorts of things. But eventually, age brings you to a completely dysregulated state. So what can you do then? Is there any hope to, make things better? In that case, the answer is no. Age will bring you to a totally dysregulated state eventually. So it's a completely hopeless battle. But when I'm meeting you today, in whatever form you are dysregulated, there is a lot of things that you are doing that is contributing to that dysregulations. And those things that you are doing that are not primary forms of regulation, of dysregulation, which means they're not behaviors that emerge out of the dysregulation. So for example, imagine I'm having a tachycardic attack, right? My heart suddenly is racing. I'm beginning to sweat. I'm feeling very, very hot and overwhelmed. Suddenly I faint, right? Or to not faint, I have to go and take a shower and put myself in cold water, right? Or just take a cold towel and put it around me, or pat my arms to just bring down the temperature, and and try to regulate a bit. That behavior emerges out of my heart suddenly starts to racing, right? Yeah. So that behavior is a consequence of the dysregulation, but there are also behaviors that are a preamble to the dysregulation, right? So if, for example, my sleep is very dysregulated, whether I'm an old man or because I'm mentally ill, and I have the habit of looking at my phone for 30 minutes just before falling asleep, that is definitely not going to help, because the function of those videos is to stimulate the dopamine, motivational system of our hormonal system. And so that goes against the need of going to sleep. When I go to sleep, I need to down-regulate my motivations, not up-regulate them, right? So yeah, this is definitely something that we need to keep talking about. I've diverged a little bit from the main topic, but I hope to have brought a little bit of clarity about how I see mental illness and what the main work is in trying to tackling this. But also with the ACE test, we mostly talk about why this is important, right? And I think I haven't quite put my finger on why that is important today. And I really look forward to do this next week, Rene.
Absolutely, and thank you for that very extensive background and laying the foundation of understanding mental illness, understanding even for those who experience this, is there hope? Whether you're mentally ill, whether also you had these attempts of ending your own life, someone who's going through it, the weight that they feel, but there is still hope. So I think it's a very good foundation to start off. with. We'll definitely be tackling more in the next episodes. Thank you for that. And for all those who still haven't taken the test, the QR code is always here. Take the test. It's a very easy QR code. There's no particular commercial interest. It's very free. You can just go through all 10 questions. Also, another one, you can buy us a coffee to just help support as we bring these materials. And as you mentioned, and also as I mentioned earlier, a bit earlier, that there's something special. A special guest will be coming on to help us support these discussions that are very, very fundamental. So thank you again, Nicholas, for sharing the background for this question. And as we get to diverge it even more, for sure next week the same time. So thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, YouTubers. Thank you, Instagrammers. Bye-bye.